They hired her to cook, but never imagined she'd become their home. When Eleanor Hart, a 50-year-old widow with calloused hands and a quiet heart, stepped onto the ranch, the Cowboys didn't see worth, they saw weight. They mocked her behind her back, calling her the leftover woman, laughing at how her apron barely tied around her waist. She smiled anyway. They never knew she'd once buried a child, or that every pot she stirred was her way of keeping grief from boiling over. But one evening during a coal dust supper, a boy no one paid much mind to, Dusty Boots' crooked collar, pulled gently at her skirt and whispered, "Mama." That one word shattered the distance between her and everyone in that room. From that moment on, Eleanor wasn't just the cook. She became the warmth, the voice that called them in from the cold, the only thing that softened a house full of men who'd forgotten how to be loved. So what did a boy without a mother and a woman without a child truly see in each other? And what happened when the ranchers finally saw it too? You'll want to stay for the moment. They all realized she wasn't just filling bellies, she was rebuilding a family. Have you ever found a home where you least expected? If Eleanor's story stirred something in you, leave us a comment below. Would you like to see more stories like this about late-in-life love, unexpected family, and quiet healing on the frontier? They didn't see her when she walked through the door. Not really. To them, she was just another woman with flour on her apron and soft lines on her face. Too old for the saloon, too quiet for the gossip benches, too plain for a glance that lasted longer than politeness demanded. Her name was Eleanor Hart, 51, widowed 3 winters ago, once a farmer's wife in Abilene, now a cook for hire traveling ranch to ranch. She came with a wooden trunk full of iron pots, a knife wrapped in oilcloth, and a heart that still beat steady despite being cracked down the middle. They laughed the first time she unpacked her skillet. Some of the younger cowboys nudged each other and whispered words like spinster and left behind. But Eleanor didn't flinch. She placed the skillet on the stove with the quiet reverence of a pastor laying down scripture. "Stew at 6, she told them, not waiting for approval. The ranch belonged to a man named Silas Calloway, mid-50s, gruff with a limp in one leg and 6 boys under his roof, who weren't all his by blood, but all his by choice. Orphaned sons of dead ranch hands, cousins dropped off like bad debts, and one child who hadn't spoken since the night his mother walked into a storm and never came back. Eleanor didn't ask for their stories. She just made cornbread that didn't crumble and beans that didn't burn. And at night, when the house quieted and the fire turned to ember, she'd sit alone at the long kitchen table, her hands folded, not in prayer, but in the quiet steadiness of someone still here, still offering something. They didn't see her when she arrived, but they would. What happens when someone chooses to stay where they've only been tolerated? The mornings came cold in that part of the West, but Eleanor Hart had known colder. She stoked the fire before dawn, kneaded dough with stiff fingers, and never once asked for help. The Cowboys barely acknowledged her beyond their empty plates, and that suited her just fine, until the smallest of the children, barely 6, with shaggy hair and eyes too solemn for his age, followed her into the pantry one morning. He didn't speak, just stood there watching her jar up honey, his bare feet silent on the worn floorboards. "You're not lost, are you?" Eleanor asked gently, not turning around. The boy shook his head. She paused. "Do you have a name, sweetheart?" The boy's voice was gravel soft, like it hadn't been used in years. "Elias." She turned then. The name sat heavy in the air. A name with echoes. "Well," she said, crouching to his level. "Elias, would you help me carry this butter to the stove?" He nodded, took the crock in both hands like it was a treasure. From that moment, Elias became her shadow. He brought her mismatched spoons from the barn. He stood beside her at the stove and watched the fat bubble. He ate whatever she made without complaint. And 3 nights later, as the wind howled across the plains, Eleanor tucked an extra quilt over the sleeping children and turned to leave when a tiny voice behind her whispered, "Mama." The word was so soft she nearly thought she imagined it. But when she turned, Elias was sitting up, eyes wide and scared at what had escaped his mouth. She said nothing, just knelt beside him and placed her palm over his heart. It beat fast, hopeful, afraid. Can a word spoken once break through years of silence and sorrow? The next morning, the ranch house breathed a different kind of quiet, not cold, not cruel, just watchful. Eleanor Hart felt it in the way the floorboards creaked a little more tenderly, how the wind tapped gently instead of screaming through the shutters. The men said nothing of the night before if they even knew, but Elias stayed close. Not with childish neediness, but with a steady, silent loyalty that clung to her like a second shawl. She cooked as always, hot cakes, bacon, eggs, but now there was one chair always pulled close to her own at the table, a napkin neatly folded the way Elias had seen her do. He didn't say "Mom" again, not aloud, but Eleanor saw it in the way he handed her a wildflower plucked from beside the trough, how he stood between her and the others when their jokes turned rough, the way he traced the hem of her apron with his small thumb when he thought she wasn't looking. Some of the older cowboys noticed. Boy's soft one muttered mouth full of beans. Boy's smart Eleanor answered her voice even but firm like a barn beam. Knows kindness when he sees it. And then there was Cal Rutledge the father, the man of the house. He hadn't said much to her since hiring her on after his wife died 2 winters back. Just nods and quick glances. But lately those glances lingered a second too long. One evening he came into the kitchen with no excuse. Just stood there hat in hand, awkward as a boy at his first dance. "You good with the children?" he said, eyes low. "I try to be," she answered, not looking up from the dough. "They like you," he continued. "Even Bethy and she don't take to nobody." "I like them too," she whispered. "They're good, even when they pretend not to be." He hesitated. "You ever had children of your own?" She paused, then nodded slowly. "Once." She didn't explain. He didn't ask. Outside, the wind changed direction. Inside, something else shifted too. When a man and woman both carry silence, who dares speak first, and why that winter came early. Snow dusted the ridge like sifted sugar, and the mornings were all breath and brittle boots. But in the warmth of the Rutledge ranch house, something slow and sacred was stirring. Eleanor Hart now moved through the rooms like someone who'd always been meant to, checking boots for holes, turning quilts in the sun, braiding Bethy's wild hair, while the girl grumbled and leaned into her shoulder like she didn't mean to. She didn't cook like the late Mrs. Rutledge. She cooked like Eleanor, simple, hearty meals with a quiet sort of care folded into every spoonful. And the children, without realizing, began to come to her, not only with hunger, but with small cuts and bigger questions. Who else would explain why stars moved or why people left? But it was Cal Rutledge who remained the deepest riddle. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't distant, but he was haunted in a way that made the house quieter when he entered. He often came in late from the field's dust in his hair and grief in his collarbones. One evening, as Eleanor mended Elias's sleeve by firelight, Cal spoke from the doorway. "I thought I'd stop hearing her laugh," he said suddenly, "but I still do. In the loft, in the pantry, in the creek bed where she washed the youngest." Eleanor looked up, her hands stilled on the thread. "I don't want to replace her," he added. "I just don't want to be alone in a house that only echoes." Eleanor nodded. "You're not asking me to take her place." He sat beside her, the weight of him warming the bench. "I'm asking," he said gently, "if there's room in your heart for them, for me, not to erase, but to begin again." Outside, the snow whispered secrets against the window. Inside, Eleanor Hart let her hand rest near his, not touching, but not far. Sometimes healing didn't come with grand declarations. Sometimes it came with two hands sitting quietly beside one another, in the light of a forgiving fire. When one heart begins again, will the other dare follow? By the time spring thawed the fence posts and coaxed the first green from the cottonwoods, Eleanor Hart was no longer the cook to anyone under that roof. She was Mama Eleanor to the younger ones, especially Bethy, who had taken to holding her hand when thunder clapped or when the fire sputtered low. To the older boys, Eleanor was the quiet steadiness that filled the spaces their mother once did not, never replacing, just mending gently what had been frayed by grief and time. But it was Cal Rutledge who still held back, though his gaze lingered longer and his silences softened. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday in the dusty sack tied behind the post-rider's saddle. Its envelope was thin, brittle, and addressed to Eleanor Hart, though the handwriting, bold heavy, was unmistakably from the past. She read it in the barn away from curious eyes. And when she was done, she sat still for a long time, the letter folded neatly in her lap like the way a woman folds sorrow after wearing it too long. That night, as the family gathered for stew and cornbread, Cal noticed her quiet. Later, when the children had gone to sleep and the oil lamp flickered between them, he asked softly, "Bad news?" Eleanor nodded. It's my late husband's brother. He's dying. Wants me to come sit beside him for the end. Will you go, Cal asked, though his voice was laced with something he tried hard to hide, fear maybe, or longing. She looked at him with the kind of gaze that had learned not to rush love nor expect rescue. I don't know yet, she said. He was cruel to me once. But forgiveness, it's a slow wind. Sometimes it still blows. Cal was silent a long moment. Then almost inaudibly, he said, I'd miss your laugh in the pantry. That was the first time either had admitted aloud that their lives had started intertwining like vines after rain. And then Elias, half asleep at the stairwell, called down Mama Eleanor. Are you still there? She stood across the room and touched the boy's head. Still here, sweetheart. Cal watched her with a reverence, not of possession, but of quiet awe. The kind of love that didn't ask for attention, only presence. What happens when the past calls just as the heart begins to feel at home? The morning Eleanor Hart left for Nebraska, the kitchen smelled of cinnamon and salt pork, and the house felt strangely hollow like the space between breaths before a prayer. Cal Rutledge helped load her small satchel onto the wagon. He didn't say much, just tipped his hat lower than usual and muttered, Ride careful now. She gave each child a kiss on the crown. Bethy cried quietly into her apron. Elias clung to her waist and whispered, You promise you'll come back. I promise, sweetheart. She said, though part of her wasn't sure she'd have the strength to return, not if her heart broke again. The ride to Nebraska was long and bitter. Winter clung to the edges of the prairie like a jealous ghost. But Eleanor sat tall when, biting her cheeks, the old letter pressed to her chest. When she arrived at the creaking farmhouse where her husband's brother lay dying, she was greeted by a silence colder than snow. Henry, pale and withered, blinked when he saw her. You really came, he rasped. She sat by his bed not out of obligation, but because she needed to hear something, anything that might untangle her past. And on the third day he finally said it. I should have stopped him. My brother, what he did to you. I let it happen. I'm sorry. Eleanor didn't weep. She simply took his hand, nodded once and said, Thank you. Those two words closed a chapter that had stayed open far too long. When she returned home 3 weeks later, the ranch was quieter than she remembered. But as the wagon crested the hill, she saw 6 small figures running toward her arms, waving wildly. And behind them, standing with one hand over his heart and the other shading his eyes, was Cal. He didn't say a word when she stepped down. He just handed her a cloth-wrapped bundle, fresh biscuits still warm from the oven. I kept the fire going, he said. She smiled. I know. Forgiveness set her free, but what would she choose now that her heart was her own again? The wind that winter softened early, as if the land itself was holding its breath. By March, daffodils were peeking out behind the well house, and the cattle grazed on tufts of green, not seen since before Eleanor Hart had arrived. She was back now, not as a cook, not as a widow, but as herself, fully, quietly, wholly. The day she returned from Nebraska, Cal Rutledge had lit every oil lamp before dusk. And when the children gathered close that night, unprompted, Elias rested his head on her shoulder and whispered Mama's home. No one corrected him. The next morning, Eleanor found her name neatly painted on a small wooden plaque hanging above the kitchen door, Miss Ellie's kitchen. It wasn't fancy, but it was hers. Weeks passed. The children began to call her Mama Ellie, as if they'd always known her. And Cal, he didn't speak of love. He showed it instead in the way he handed her the first cup of coffee each morning, or how he built her a rocking chair that creaked just right by the fire, or how he stood next to her in silence when the evenings ached too loud. But one evening when the wind had turned gold with spring, and the prairie was hushed in that way, that only means something holy is near, Cal stepped outside with her after supper. They stood on the porch. No words, just stars. Then he cleared his throat and said, I was wondering if you might want to take my name. Not because you have to, but because I'd sure be proud if you did. Eleanor looked at him, eyes steady. I don't need a new name to belong here, Cal. He nodded, slow and thoughtful. But I'd like to be yours anyway, she added, voice soft as dusk. He looked like a man who had been holding his breath for 20 years and finally exhaled. They didn't kiss. They just stood side by side, palms touching, as the stars stitched their quiet blessing above them. The porch light flickered once, then held steady. And inside, 6 children whispered stories by firelight, already writing their next chapter. Love doesn't always thunder in it, sometimes tiptoes in on tired feet, offering coffee and kindness. Sometimes healing doesn't come with thunder. It comes in the quiet clink of dishes being washed side by side, in a boy's hand reaching up for a woman who never stopped giving, in a man realizing that kindness cooks better than any spice. Eleanor Hart didn't set out to become anyone's mother. She only wanted a roof over her head and a stove to keep her hands busy. But what she gave and what she received was more than she ever dared hope for. And maybe that's what love really is. Not grand gestures, not perfect timing, just choosing each other day after day until one day you can't remember when me became us. So if you've ever felt passed over, too old, too big, too late, I hope this story reminds you, you are never too anything to be the beginning of someone's everything. If this story touched your heart the way Eleanor touched that ranch house, I invite you to subscribe to None, Wild West Saga. We share stories that honor quiet courage, unexpected family, and love that arrives late but lingers deep. Let us know in the comments, would you like to see more stories like Eleanor's, or even a part 2? What moment moved you most? Because sometimes all it takes is one voice saying, "You belong here." And suddenly the silence inside us turns into a song. Until the next ride, partner.